You know that feeling. You're driving somewhere. Maybe it's nothing special, grocery run, picking someone up, the kind of errand you've done 1,000 times. And a song comes on, and you stop. Not because it's loud, not because it's trying to get your attention, but because something in it reaches into a part of your brain you forgot was still open, and it says, quietly but absolutely clearly, pay attention. This is different. That moment. You know it. If you grew up listening to Miles Davis, you know it from the first time, Kind of Blue played in a room you were in. If you came up on Motown, you know it from the first time Marvin Gaye's What's Going On stopped a conversation cold. If you were a Coltrane listener, you know it from A Love Supreme. That moment when music stops being background and becomes the only thing in the room. I want to talk to you today about a song that gave a number of very serious, very credentialed jazz musicians exactly that moment. And I want to do it honestly, which means I'm going to tell you right up front that this song comes from a part of the music world you probably haven't paid much attention to. A part you may have dismissed. A part that, frankly, has given most serious music listeners very little reason not to dismiss it. And then I'm going to make the case, backed by the people who know music best, that this particular song is something genuinely different. Something worth your time and your ears. The song is called Smeraldo Garden Marching Band. The artist is a young man named Jimin, a member of the South Korean pop group BTS. And yes, it is, by commercial classification, K-pop. Stay with me, because Quincy Jones spent 50 years telling anyone who would listen that good music doesn't carry a passport. And he was right then, and the music we're about to discuss is going to prove he's still right now. Let's get something out of the way first, because if we don't, it's going to sit in the room with us the entire time. There is a completely reasonable, completely understandable skepticism toward K-pop among listeners who built their musical sensibilities in the decades when popular music was expected to carry weight. When the Beatles could stop a generation in its tracks, not just with a melody, but with a chord change. When Stevie Wonder's albums were conversations about what was happening in America. When a jazz record wasn't background music, it was an argument, a philosophy, a way of being alive in the world. K-pop, as a genre and as an industry, has given serious music lovers very little reason to look past that skepticism. The genre is built, largely, on an industrial model that treats music as a vehicle for something else, for visual spectacle, for parasocial connection, for the carefully engineered devotion of fan communities. The music itself, in a large portion of a genre's output, is secondary to the package it arrives in. That is a fair observation. It is not prejudice. It is pattern recognition. But, and this is a very large but, the error of applying a genre-wide critique to a specific piece of music is the same error that once kept serious listeners away from Stevie Wonder because he was on a pop label. It's the same error that kept jazz purists from engaging with hip-hop for 2 decades, right up until people like Jason Moran started pointing out that what Rakim was doing rhythmically was as sophisticated as anything happening in the concert hall. The label tells you where the music is sold. It does not tell you what the music is. Smeraldo Garden Marching Band was released in March of 2023. It came from a solo album called Face, the debut solo record of a 27-year-old Korean artist who spent the better part of his adult life as one of the most globally visible entertainers on earth. And tucked inside that album, not as the lead single, not as the promotional centerpiece, but as something that clearly mattered more to the artist than its commercial positioning suggested, was a collaboration that stopped some very experienced ears cold. Let me tell you exactly why. Let's go inside the music. The first thing a jazz musician notices about Smeraldo Garden Marching Band, and the first thing that tells you this is not a standard commercial product, is what the song does in its opening bars. Most contemporary pop songs, and this is especially true of K-pop, open with what producers call a hook grab. An immediate sonic statement. Something loud, something memorable, something specifically engineered to prevent you from hitting skip in the first 3 seconds. It's a technique born entirely from the anxieties of the streaming era, and while it works in a commercial sense, the numbers bear it out, it is almost always artistically hollow. The song announces itself before it has done anything to earn that announcement. Smeraldo Garden Marching Band does the exact opposite. It opens with restraint, with something that sits in the warm, ambiguous space between a string pad and a synthesizer, not quite either, and more interesting for being neither. It establishes a harmonic foundation before a single melody note is played. It creates a room and puts you inside it before it asks you to feel anything. That is not a pop technique. That is a jazz technique. That is the technique of atmosphere before argument, of space before statement. Marcus Shelby, San Francisco-based jazz bassist and composer, Carnegie Hall, the whole credential list, described the opening chord voicing of this song in terms that any music theory student would recognize immediately. He said it sits in a state of harmonic irresolution that isn't quite tension and isn't quite calm. It's what he called, and I think this is a beautiful phrase, an open question. The music asks something before it says anything, and the listener, almost without knowing why, leans in. That technique is as old as Duke Ellington. It goes back to the first time a bandleader understood that silence and suggestion are more powerful than noise and declaration. And the fact that it appears here, in a piece of music released in 2023 by a Korean pop artist, is either a remarkable coincidence or evidence of a musical intelligence that doesn't advertise itself, but is absolutely present. I believe it's the latter, and I'm going to show you why. Now let's talk about production, because this is where the song does something that made several jazz musicians and producers do what I can only describe as a genuine double take. There's a problem that has plagued recorded music since digital production became dominant, and it's a problem that most listeners feel without being able to name it. When you layer electronic elements, synthesized strings, programmed drums, digital processing, over each other in the way that contemporary pop records are made, the result can be sleek, modern, impressive in a technical sense. But it often feels, in a way the ear can't quite articulate but absolutely senses, somehow dishonest. The great jazz recordings, from the Blue Note sessions of the 50s, through the ECM releases of the 70s and 80s, through the classic Impulse catalog, had breath in them. You could hear the room. You could hear that human beings were present when the music was made. The imperfections were the point. The slight inconsistency in a piano attack, the room tone bleeding around a bass line, the way a drummer's hi-hat sits just a hair behind the beat, because that's what a human being does. Those imperfections are not flaws. They are evidence of life. What the producers of Smeraldo Garden Marching Band achieved, and this is specific, this is technical, this is not me being poetic, is what I would call synthetic breath. The electronic elements of this record have been treated with enough warmth, enough deliberate organic imperfection, that the ear accepts them as living things. There is a variation in the attack of certain synthesized notes that mimics the natural inconsistency of a human hand on a real instrument. You will never consciously hear it, but your nervous system will register it. And that registration is the difference between a track that feels produced and a track that feels inhabited. Terry Lyne Carrington, Grammy-winning jazz drummer, founder of the Berklee Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice, made an observation about the rhythmic foundation of this song that I keep coming back to. She said the groove breathes, not in a metaphorical sense. In a technical sense, the beat does not lock into a rigid metronomic grid and stay there. There are slight, almost imperceptible variations in the way the rhythm sits against the melodic phrases, variations that create forward momentum without instability. Jazz musicians have a word for this at its most fundamental level. They call it swing. Not the specific rhythmic feel of 1930s big band music, the larger principle. The principle that rhythm should feel like something alive rather than something mechanical. That a groove should pull you forward the way a conversation pulls you forward, not the way a metronome ticks. Pop music almost never achieves this, because every production tool and every commercial pressure pushes toward quantization, toward the perfect grid, toward the mathematically precise pulse that sounds clean and modern and leaves absolutely nothing to chance. Someone in the production of this song made the opposite choice. They kept the grid slightly, beautifully imperfect. And that choice is, more than almost anything else, why this is a track you come back to rather than a track you play once and move on from. I want to spend a moment on the brass elements of this song because they represent one of its most sophisticated and least discussed musical decisions. Think about how brass is used in contemporary popular music. Think about the horns in virtually any pop or rock song from the last 3 decades. In almost every case, they function as accents, as punctuation, a horn stab here, a brass flourish there, moments of excitement or emphasis that punctuate an already established emotional energy. Exclamation points, not sentences. Decoration, not architecture. The brass in Smeraldo Garden Marching Band does something fundamentally different. It functions as what the ancient Greeks called a chorus, not a vocal chorus in the pop sense, but a Greek chorus. A presence that doesn't just observe the drama but participates in it. That doesn't comment on the emotion from outside the narrative, but inhabits the emotion from within. If you know Gil Evans' arrangements for Miles Davis, Miles Ahead, Porgy and Bess, Sketches of Spain, you know exactly the technique I'm describing. Evans understood that brass instruments don't have to be loud to be powerful. That a low, soft horn line moving beneath a melody can carry more emotional weight than the loudest climax in a conventional arrangement. That the way a brass voice enters and recedes within a musical texture can function the way a supporting character functions in a great novel, present, purposeful, changing the meaning of everything around it without ever demanding center stage. That is what the brass does in this song. It enters and recedes with conversational intelligence. It deepens the emotional space rather than punctuating it. And for anyone who grew up listening to the great jazz orchestral recordings of the 50s and 60s, hearing that sensibility appear in a 2023 pop song is, and I don't use this word lightly, genuinely startling. Now I want to talk about the two performances at the center of this record, because this is where the musical intelligence becomes most visible and most personal. Jimin's vocal work on this song has been described by several classically and jazz-trained vocalists as one of the most technically sophisticated performances to appear on a mainstream pop record in years. And I want to explain precisely what that means, because it's easy to say and easy to dismiss without the specifics. The sophistication is not in range. It's not in power or volume. The performance is, notably, restrained throughout. The sophistication is in two things: the control of tone color, what musicians call timbre, and the placement of phrases within the rhythmic and harmonic space of the arrangement. Jazz vocal pedagogy has a concept called sitting behind the beat. It refers to the practice of placing melodic phrases very slightly after the rhythmic pulse, rather than directly on it. The effect, done well, is a sense of ease that borders on the inevitable. The singer sounds so comfortable inside the music that there is no urgency, no need to rush, no grasping for the note. It is associated with the greatest jazz vocalists in history. Billie Holiday did it instinctively. Frank Sinatra at his most relaxed and confident did it deliberately. Chet Baker built an entire vocal identity on it. Jimin does it throughout this song with a naturalness that is either the product of extraordinary instinctive musicality or a level of technical vocal development that the mainstream coverage of his career has never adequately discussed. Possibly both. And then Loco enters. Loco is a rapper, a Korean rapper from the independent hip-hop scene. From AOMG, the label founded by JiminPark, which has been for years one of the most credible homes for non-commercial Korean hip-hop. In lesser collaborations, and there have been many, the rapper's role is purely structural. Provide rhythmic contrast, add sonic texture, give a song a section that sounds different from the idol vocal. It is about as musically interesting as pressing a button. What Loco does is something entirely different. He responds, not to the song structure, to its emotional content. His flow moves through his section with the kind of rhythmic confidence that takes years to develop, but what makes it remarkable is that it maintains the harmonic and emotional center of what Jimin built while simultaneously opening new dimensions within it. He doesn't solo over the existing structure. He deepens it. Jason Moran, jazz pianist, composer, Kennedy Center artistic director for jazz, has written about the ways in which the best rappers and the best jazz musicians are engaged in identical cognitive processes. The simultaneous management of melodic contour, rhythmic placement, harmonic implication, and emotional communication in real time. Through that framework, Loco's 47 seconds in this song reveal themselves, on repeated listening, as something that would be recognized in any musical tradition as collaborative intelligence of a high order. And here's what ties it all together. At no point in the song does either performer feel larger or more important than the other. Jimin does not dominate. Loco does not follow. They are equal voices in a conversation. And genuine musical equality between collaborators, the kind where both people are fully present and fully themselves, and neither is diminished by the presence of the other, that is rarer than any technical skill. It is rarer than any chart position. And it is, ultimately, the thing that makes a piece of music last. Let me tell you what Smeraldo Garden Marching Band doesn't do. Because in contemporary music, what a song refuses to do is often as revealing as what it chooses to do. It does not build to an explosive chorus. It does not employ the drop, that moment of sudden sonic release that has become the structural crutch of virtually every piece of electronic-influenced popular music in the past 15 years. It does not resolve its emotional tension with a moment of cathartic release designed to trigger a dopamine response in the listener and make the song feel satisfying in the way a processed food is satisfying, immediately, completely, and without any lasting nourishment. Instead, it builds and sustains a mood, with patience, with confidence, with a trust in the listener that is simply not common in music designed for mass commercial consumption. That trust is the rarest quality in popular music. And it is the quality that separates music that endures from music that merely succeeds. Think about the albums that have stayed with you across 50 years of listening. Kind of Blue rewards the 100th listen more than the first. What's Going On becomes a richer, stranger experience the more deeply you enter it. Tapestry, Inner Visions, The Colon Concert. Every one of those records was made by someone who trusted that the listener would come back, who built into the music a depth that reveals itself gradually over repeated encounters to listeners who bring patience and attention. Smeraldo Garden Marching Band is built the same way. It is not trying to give you everything in one sitting. It is trying to give you something real that you can return to. And in a musical landscape dominated by disposable experiences, that ambition, quiet, unannounced, utterly serious, is radical. I want to pause here and ask a question that I think is worth sitting with. Not because it has a clean answer, it doesn't, but because the act of asking it tells us something important about where we are in the history of popular music. The question is this: how do we know in the moment whether what we are hearing is music that will last? It is easy to identify lasting music in retrospect. We know now that Kind of Blue was a permanent shift in the language of jazz because 50 years of musicians and listeners have confirmed it. We know that Marvin Gaye's What's Going On rewrote what a pop album was allowed to say and how it was allowed to say it because the culture absorbed it and kept absorbing it, decade after decade, without exhausting it. We know these things because time has done the work of confirmation for us. But in 1959, when Kind of Blue was released, there were serious, credentialed jazz musicians who thought Miles Davis was being too minimal, too restrained, too quiet. In 1971, there were Motown executives who were not sure What's Going On was the right move. The things that make music last are often the same things that make it initially difficult to place: the restraint, the patience, the refusal to give you everything at once, the insistence on asking more of the listener than the listener is necessarily used to being asked. By those measures, restraint, patience, depth that reveals itself gradually, the refusal to be consumed quickly, Smeraldo Garden Marching Band is doing what lasting music does. Whether it will be confirmed by the kind of time that confirmed Miles Davis and Marvin Gaye, I genuinely don't know. No one does. That is not a question any of us can answer in the present tense. What I can say is this: the musicians who heard the song and recognized something real in it were not making a cultural gesture. They were not being inclusive or open-minded as a performance. They were responding to specific, identifiable musical qualities that they had spent their careers learning to hear. The harmonic intelligence of the opening, the rhythmic breadth of the production, the vocal placement, the brass that functions as a chorus rather than a flourish, the collaborative equality of the two performers. These are not impressionistic observations. They are technical ones, and they point toward a piece of music that was made with the kind of seriousness and craft that the best music has always required. That is not a guarantee of legacy, but it is the necessary condition for one. And it is, frankly, more than most of what gets released in any given year can claim, regardless of genre, regardless of geography, regardless of the age of the people who made it. The best argument for giving this song your time is not that it is surprising. It is not that it comes from an unexpected place. Those are interesting facts, but they are not reasons. The reason is simpler and more demanding. It is good. Specifically, technically, emotionally good. In the ways that matter. In the ways that last. There is a final quality of this song I want to name before we close, because it may be the most important one. And it's the quality that most directly explains why it has found listeners among people who came of age in a completely different musical world. At its emotional core, Smeraldo Garden Marching Band is about longing, about the space between people, about the difficulty of bridging that space, and the particular kind of beauty that lives in the attempt, even when the attempt falls short. This is not a new theme in music. In many ways, it is the oldest theme in music. Every great standard from the American songbook, every torch song, every slow blues, every bossa nova recorded in the years when that form was still fresh and heartbreaking enough to stop a room. All of it circles the same territory, the distance between people, the reaching, the almost. Smeraldo Garden Marching Band circles that territory with a gentleness and a precision that anyone who has loved those earlier forms of music will recognize immediately. The sonic language is 2023. The emotional language is timeless. And that combination, a fresh vocabulary in service of the oldest human feeling, is exactly what music does when it is doing what it is supposed to do. The jazz musicians who praised the song were not being generous. They were not performing open-mindedness. They were not trying to seem current or culturally aware. They were hearing what was there. Craft in service of feeling. Technique in service of truth. A song that knows what it wants to say and says it without apology, without excess, with the directness and the restraint that only music made by people who genuinely love music ever achieves. You don't have to know who Jimin is to hear what this song is doing. You don't have to have any relationship with K-pop, or with Korean culture, or with the particular commercial world in which this music was created and released. You only have to be willing to listen with the same openness you once brought to the first time a Miles Davis record played in a room you were in. Or the first time you heard Coltrane and didn't understand it yet but felt, very clearly, that there was something there to understand. Or any moment when music arrived from an unexpected direction, from a genre you didn't follow, a culture you didn't know, a voice you'd never heard, and turned out to be exactly what you needed. That willingness is the only requirement, and the music will absolutely do the rest. So here's what I'd ask you to do. After this video ends, find Smeraldo Garden Marching Band. Find it on whatever streaming service you use. Put on headphones if you have them. Sit somewhere quiet, and listen the way you used to listen, with full attention, with patience, with the understanding that good music gives up its best things gradually and only to those who show up for them. And then come back and tell me what you heard, because I would genuinely like to know. If this conversation was worth your time, subscribe. We do this regularly, and we always take the music seriously. Leave a comment with the song, or the album that gave you your own version of that moment I described at the beginning. The one where the music stops you cold and says, pay attention. And share this with someone in your life who still believes that the best music has already been made. Because part of what makes music beautiful is that it keeps proving that wrong. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.